Here is a fact that surprises most people. Some of the most powerful men in Ottoman history, including several grand viziers who effectively ran the empire on the Sultan's behalf, started their lives as kidnapped Christian children, taken from their own families and never allowed to see them again. One of them, a boy taken from a Bosnian village, would grow up to become the second most powerful man in the entire empire, serving 3 sultans in a row and shaping Ottoman policy for over a decade. This is the story of the system that took children from conquered territory and turned some of them into the empire's most loyal soldiers, and others into its most capable administrators. A system built on calculated brutality that helped the Ottoman state survive, in one form or another, for 623 years, from 1299 to 1922. Before we go further, everything in this video is drawn from documented Ottoman history, Ottoman administrative and legal records, contemporary chronicles, and the work of modern historians of the empire. This is the story of the Devshirme system, and the Janissary Corps it created. The Ottoman state began in 1299, a small frontier principality in northwestern Anatolia founded by Osman I. For its first century, it expanded the way most medieval states did, through feudal cavalry drawn from Turkish nobility, loyal to local lords first and the ruler second. That structure had an obvious weakness: soldiers whose primary loyalty belonged to regional nobles rather than the central state. Beginning under Sultan Murad I in the late 14th century, and formalized more fully over the following century, the Ottomans developed an alternative, the Devshirme system, sometimes translated as the child levy or blood tax. Ottoman officials would periodically travel through the empire's Christian territories, primarily in the Balkans, and select boys, typically somewhere between the ages of roughly 8 and 18, though the exact age range varied across different periods, to be taken from their families, converted to Islam, and raised entirely within Ottoman state institutions. This was not, by any modern standard, a voluntary or gentle process. Families lost their sons permanently, with no legal recourse. The boys were deliberately cut off from their birth families, their original religion, and any local or regional loyalty that might compete with loyalty to the Sultan himself. What happened to these boys next depended entirely on ability, not birth. The most promising, based on intelligence and aptitude identified through Ottoman assessment, were sent to the Enderun, an elite palace school inside Topkapi Palace, where they received rigorous education in languages, administration, military strategy, and statecraft, training that could eventually lead to the very highest positions in the empire's government. The rest were channeled into the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's standing infantry, where they underwent intense military training and discipline from a young age, developing into some of the most effective infantry in Europe for roughly 2 centuries. The specific case of Sokalu Mehmed Pasha illustrates exactly how far this system could take someone. Born into an Orthodox Christian family in Ottoman Bosnia, he was taken through the Devshirme system as a boy, converted to Islam, and rose steadily through Ottoman state service. By the 1560s, he had become Grand Vizier, the empire's chief minister, effectively running day-to-day governance on behalf of the Sultan, and he held that position under 3 consecutive sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim II, and Murad III, spanning roughly 14 years at the absolute center of Ottoman power. This is the same Sokalu Mehmed Pasha who, as we've covered elsewhere, managed the concealment of Suleiman's death during the 1566 siege of Sijitvar long enough to secure an orderly succession. He was not an isolated exception. Historians studying Ottoman administrative records have found that a striking number of grand viziers across the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries began their lives as Devshirme recruits, meaning that for long stretches of Ottoman history, much of the empire's actual governing class was made up of men who had entered the system as enslaved children from conquered Christian territory. This mattered enormously for how the empire actually functioned. Because Devshirme recruits owed their position entirely to the Sultan and had no independent power base, no hereditary land claim, and no competing family loyalty within the Ottoman aristocracy, they became, in practice, extraordinarily loyal and dependent servants of the central state. A professional administrative and military class the Ottoman sultans could rely on in ways that hereditary feudal nobility, with its own competing interests, never fully allowed in most contemporary European kingdoms. The Janissary Corps that emerged from this system became the empire's most feared military force for roughly 2 centuries, central to Ottoman victories from the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 through the sieges and battles that expanded Ottoman territory across the Balkans and the Middle East. For much of this period, Janissaries were also subject to strict internal discipline, including, for a significant stretch of the Corps' early history, formal restrictions on marriage and family life, intended specifically to keep their loyalty focused entirely on the Corps and the Sultan, rather than on private family interests that might compete with military duty. That discipline did not last indefinitely. In 1568, Ottoman policy shifted to allow Janissaries to marry, and over the following generations, positions within the core increasingly began passing informally from father to son, the exact kind of hereditary interest the original system had been designed specifically to prevent. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissary Corps had transformed from an elite meritocratic institution built from outsiders into something closer to a hereditary, self-interested political class defending its own privileges, a shift we've traced in more detail in the story of the Corps' eventual violent abolition under Sultan Mehmed II in 1826. So here is the shape of the full story. A system built on calculated cruelty, taking children by force from their families, stripping them of their birth identity, and rebuilding their loyalty entirely around the state, produced, for roughly 2 centuries, one of the most effective combinations of military force and administrative talent in the early modern world. It allowed the Ottoman state to draw its most capable servants from anywhere within its vast territory, regardless of birth, at a time when most European monarchies remained far more constrained by hereditary nobility protecting its own interests. And the same system, once its original discipline eroded, became one of the significant obstacles to reform that the empire struggled with for its final 2 centuries. A core that had once given the Ottomans a decisive edge over their rivals became, by the 19th century, one of the institutions most resistant to the very modernization the empire needed to keep pace with industrializing European powers. Here is the irony worth sitting with. The system's entire original purpose was to eliminate competing loyalty and hereditary self-interest from the empire's military and administrative core. For roughly 2 centuries, it worked exactly as designed. But institutions, even ones built specifically to resist the normal human instinct to pass privilege onto one's own children, eventually tend to find a way to do exactly that anyway. And when the Janissary Corps finally did, the empire was left needing to violently dismantle the very system that had built much of its early success, nearly 450 years after that system was first created. The Ottoman state that began in 1299 did not survive as a coherent, continuously functioning institution purely because of any one policy. But the Devshirme system and the Janissary Corps it produced explain a great deal about how a relatively small Anatolian principality grew, within a few centuries, into an empire that would last in some form, until 1922, 623 years, one of the longest continuous runs of any state in recorded history. The lesson underneath the drama is a difficult one, precisely because the system's cruelty and its effectiveness were not separate facts sitting side by side, they were the same fact. The Devshirme system's brutality wasn't incidental to why it worked. Taking children from their families and rebuilding their loyalty entirely around the state was the mechanism that produced men like Sokalu Mehmed Pasha, with no competing loyalty to slow them down. History rarely offers a clean separation between a system's moral cost and its practical power. Sometimes, uncomfortably, they are built from exactly the same material. This has been the story of the system that helped build, and eventually strained, 623 years of Ottoman rule.